It's that time of year again when our valley is inundated with days and days of an inversion, which basically means those clouds that are typically high in the sky are very low and to the ground. So we have lots of dense fog. So dense, in fact, in the evenings, sometimes you can't see more than 10 feet in front of you. It makes for really beautiful frost on every surface, but it is very cold, and doing outdoor chores is not our favorite task. But the chickens still have to be taken care of, so while we're outside, we try and enjoy the beauty of this winter weather. Because it's cold outside, this week is the perfect time to make bone broth. We are working to clear out our freezer so that we can put some of the chickens that we butchered in the last video away for the season. So we're pulling out some of our older cuts of meat as well as cuts of chicken, like these chicken quarters that we have bags of. And we are cooking them up. I used my Instant Pot to cook these chicken quarters up. And now I'm removing the meat and putting them on one tray, and then all of the bones and the skin will go into a separate bowl, and those bones and skin will be used to make bone broth. Now the meat is not going to go to waste. We are cutting up all of this chicken and we are going to put it in the freeze dryer today and freeze dry it to place on our shelves for soups and casseroles later on in the winter. So we don't waste any of the meat. Now we are making chicken broth as well as some beef broth today. So I like to save all of my bones for my chicken and my beef when we cook, and I'll place those in a bag in the freezer, and then once we're ready we can pull those bags out and use them for bone broth. So homemade bone broth is just fabulous. So there is no waste here. Now the chicken here, you can see I'm cutting it up into about 1/2 inch to 1 inch pieces, and then I will place those into the freezer and allow them to freeze pretty much overnight so that we can put them in the freeze dryer. It just cuts down on some of the time on the freeze dryer and uses a little less of our electricity. Today. We've got a crock pot here of our 3rd round of beef broth. It's just bones and discarded veggies that we've had in the freezer. We have on the stovetop over here some already made bone broth that we're just heating up so that we can get it into our pressure cooker, which is on the other burner. So lots of things happening here. We also have some chicken broth in the Instapot that we've been cooking this morning that we'll probably try and get into the pressure cooker as well. So there's a lot going on this morning, but I kind of wanted to show you what the beef broth looks like when we take it out of the crock pot. Now, a lot of people will just do their broth on, or their stock on the stovetop. Again, I've done it in the Instant Pot as well, so pressure cooked it that way. I like it in the slow cooker because I feel like it pulls out a lot more of the flavors from the bones as well as the veggies, but that's just me. But let me just kind of show you what it looks like, kind of the coloring, and then we'll go ahead and start canning. I have found that the easiest way to make broth is to save my bones and vegetable scraps over a period of time. So chicken bones from meals that we've eaten, or just like I did earlier, pulling the meat off the bone, beef bones that I have from steaks or roasts or whatever, I will save those in a Ziploc bag in my freezer for weeks, sometimes even months, and they are perfect in the freezer. Then when I'm ready to make stock and I have enough bones and enough vegetables, I pull out my slow cookers I place the bones at the bottom of the slow cooker with veggies on top, fill it with water, and let it simmer for about 12 hours. I typically will use onions, carrots, celery, and sometimes garlic scraps for my broth. But this works for chicken or beef bones. So when I pull my bone broth out, I have a bowl. And just gonna take the lid off of my crock pot here. And you can see how deep the color is of this bone broth. So this has bones. So right there, it's one of the bones. It has veggies. You could also add, some herbs if you wanted certain flavors. But I'm just gonna kind of smash those veggies and pull off any juice that might be in them. And then, let me grab a plate here. I'll just transfer it to a plate or a bowl so that I can either continue to use it, because you can get several batches of broth out of one set of bones. Now you can see here, this is a good example. So this bone here, all of the marrow that was inside this bone is now gone. That's what I want. I want my bones to have nothing left in them, if at all possible. That way, I'm getting all of that yummy beef flavor. So this one still has a little bit in it. So really, I could do another batch of bone broth if I want. So this broth is really good, for like beef stews, adding it to any recipe that calls for broth. But I'm just pulling out all these bones. Now, I had 2 crock pots going. So I had 2 of my slow cookers going at the same time. Originally. And then I did 2 rounds of broth. And on this 3rd round, I just went ahead and combined all of the bones, meat, veggies, everything into one crock pot to get the most out of the flavor from this batch that I can. So that's kind of the difference between this one and the last one. Just trying to get as much of this out as I can. Now this bowl that I'm using is actually a little too big. Normally, you can see this bowl here. It's a little bit smaller, and my strainer actually fits, so it is a little bit easier to maneuver. This one doesn't fit as easily. I can't just set it down. So it's not as conducive to this broth as I would like, but it's gonna work. I'm actually gonna move, just to make it easier on myself, this broth we've already had in this bowl that's kind of cooled down. I'm just gonna switch bowls here, just to make my life easier. And then I'm just pouring this broth through that strainer. So I get all those little pieces of bone or veggies or whatever in this bowl. And you can see how brown and delicious that broth looks. Now, in all actuality, you do not have to have veggies in your broth. You could just have bones and water, and you will still get a good flavor. But the veggies add so much more. And all of my veggies are just leftover scraps from any meal that I use. So if I cut an onion and I have the ends that I chop off, or the skins, I throw them in a Ziploc bag in my freezer. And when that bag is full and I have enough bones in the freezer, I can make bone broth. So it's a really fast and easy and inexpensive way to make broth without having to use extra veggies and whatnot. Now I'm going to can my broth. Now you do not have to can your broth. You can place that broth into containers or Ziploc bags and place it in the freezer. You can do what I'm going to do a little bit later in the video and freeze dry your broth. But I like to can it because that way it gets out of my freezer and frees up that space, and I have a lot more shelf space or under bed space or whatever to put broth than I do in my freezer. Now for this, I like to heat my broth back up so it's all hot before I put it into my jars for canning. It will take me a couple of days to do the broth, and since it's in the refrigerator and cold, I like to start with it nice and hot in hot jars in my pressure canner. But that is just me. Now, as you're placing your broth, whether it's chicken broth or beef broth, into your jars, make sure you leave a 1-inch headspace. This will help prevent some of the siphoning that might happen, especially when you have just a jar full of broth. Make sure to clean the rims of your jars really well with a cloth as well as some vinegar before you put your lids and your rims on your jars. You want to prevent as much siphoning as possible because you worked really hard for this broth, and the most disappointing thing is if it doesn't seal and you have to try and pressure can it again. Once that broth is ready, get it into that pressure canner, get the lid on it, and get it to the point where it is releasing steam for 10 minutes straight out of that valve at the top. Once the steam has gone for 10 minutes, you can put your weight on top of it and bring it up to 10 pounds of pressure. That will depend on your elevation. Once it comes up to pressure, you will then set your timer, and for broth, it only has to cook 20 minutes for pints and 25 minutes for quarts. So it's a very quick process for broth because there's no meat or vegetables in it. Now while that broth is in the pressure canner, I'm pulling out this chicken that we cut up and put in the freezer earlier. I'm getting it ready to put into the freeze dryer. So this chicken, as well as some of the broth that we're making today, is going in the freeze dryer. And then the rest of that broth is going to be pushed in the pressure canner and canned for future use.
Now, one thing I do get questions on, because oftentimes people will see that my tray table is turned. This is just so that any moisture that's on it can come off when I'm defrosting. So simply just turn your trays like this and they're good to go. So I can put the stuff that I need to inside. Now right now we're cooling down our trays. We have about 20 more seconds until the inside of the freeze dryer is ready for the freezing process. Now we've pre-frozen our chicken, so it actually shouldn't take as long of a time to freeze dry this chicken. But we have 2 trays of chicken that we're going to freeze in here. And then we also are going to freeze a tray of chicken broth and also a tray of beef broth. And both of those will go here in the freeze dryer as well. And so then we'll just have a real nice freeze dryer full of some protein.
Now that the chicken's loaded, we can pour some of our bone broth into these extra trays and have them freeze dry along with our chicken.
The freeze dryer is done. We're ready to pull out the chicken and the broth that we put in here and see how it turns out and if it dried all the way or not.
Everything has dried up really nicely, so now it's time to put them into some jars. This is the broth. It kind of is foamy and fluffy. You can put it into a blender and mix it up so it's a real fine powder, but I'm just kind of leaving it in these chunks and shoving them into this mason jar. Now for the chicken, I'm also putting it into mason jars, and then all of these jars I will put lids on them and vacuum seal them shut so that they can last for a long time on my shelf, and then I can put them into any recipes that I want and make life just a little bit easier for our family. Just because it's cold outside doesn't mean that I can't add to our homestead and our homestead pantry. That's why I love doing broths and freeze-dried meats during the cold winter months. I can save those things up, and when it's chilly outside, I can warm up my home and my kitchen with broths and meats, and it smells delicious, and I feel like I'm still very useful during the winter months. I hope this video was helpful to your family. We'll see you guys in the next one.